My name is Monika Adamczyk Garbowska. I am professor of comparative literature at Maria Curie Skłodowska University in Lublin, and I am going to give you a short talk about literary images of Jewish Lublin and the Lublin region. I will especially focus on Yiddish literature, but I will also include some other works by Jewish authors. And first, maybe a few personal remarks. I got interested in Jewish culture, Yiddish literature, quite a long time ago, about 40 years ago, in 1970s. And this was a very great surprise for me and a great discovery when I found out that there were so many works by Jewish authors about Lublin, because I was born and raised in Lublin, but I didn't consider it a very interesting city, rather provincial city. And when you take Polish literature, Lublin doesn't occupy a significant place in Polish literature, compared, for example, with cities like Krakow, Warsaw, or Łódź, Lodz. So this was a very interesting discovery. And then when I learned Yiddish and also reading works in English, I started discovering more and more works, and I am going to quote from some of these works and sort of will make a travel, of course a brief travel through Lublin, from the old times up to now, with references to especially Yiddish authors. And even if we take some of the legends, and there is this famous legend that some of you might know about Pauline, explaining why the word in Hebrew for Poland is Pauline. Just yesterday I was at the opening of the museum in Warsaw, a new Jewish museum, and actually it's called Pauline. So anyway, there are various versions of this legend, but the best known is by Shmuel Agnon, a Hebrew writer originally from Buchacz, and he describes Jewish visitors sometime in the Middle Ages, in the 13th, 14th century, who went to the east because they had to flee from Western Europe, where they were persecuted, and a piece of paper fell from the heaven, and on it were the words, "Go to Polania." And then they actually reached that place and stayed on, and the explanation is that Pauline means "here rest for the night." But why am I quoting this legend? Because this legend, of course, may be quoted in reference to other cities, but in this particular version that Agnon wrote, we read, "When they came from the land of the Franks, they found a wood in the land, and on every tree one tractate of the Talmud was incised. This is the forest of Kawęczyn, which is near Lublin." And actually there is a forest of Kawęczyn about 80 kilometers away from Lublin, but it's interesting that no other city, Polish city, is mentioned in this legend, and Lublin is. So what does it mean? Obviously it's a legend, but it's evidence of the significance of Lublin in Jewish history. And if we take the best known Yiddish writer, Isaac Bashevis Singer, we know that one of his best known novels is The Magician of Lublin. So most people in the world, if they heard about Lublin at all, quite often it's via this particular work. But also in his earlier work, which by a number of critics is considered his best novel, Satan in Gorai, written still in 1930s, when he he was still in Poland. He lived in Warsaw because he left for the United States in 1935. The action of the novel takes place, most of it in Goraj, which is a small shtetl not far from Lublin, but also in Lublin. In Lublin, so you have very interesting depictions, of course based on imagination, but also some archival sources. Lublin in the second part of the 17th century. And this is the period after the Khmelnytsky uprising, after the Cossack Wars, which was a great blow to the Jewish community. But after these massacres, Jews started rebuilding their lives, and in one of the chapters you have a very interesting image, and here I quote from Satan in Goraj: "Around the building where the Council of the Four Lands met, marriage brokers bustled, matching prospective couples, extracting advances on their fees, beggars tugged at the jackets of passers-by, persons who were half of completely mad laughed, cried, sang, children who had lost father and mother wandered about the courtyard, abandoned, insolently begging. Daily emissaries arrived, each from a different Jewish community, recounting the suffering that had come on the heels of Khmelnytsky and the Swedish soldiers." So it's almost like an apocalyptic image of the great destruction. But on the other hand, it's interesting that all these people are coming to Lublin. And where do they meet? Around the building where the Council of the Four Lands met. And Council of the Four Lands in Hebrew Vat Aratzot was a very unique institution in Poland. This was a Jewish parliament, which was a symbol of Jewish autonomy. So no wonder that Lublin was that center where people would come, and actually where one of the rabbis, Rabbi Ashkenazi from Goraj, took refuge in Lublin. Also in this particular novel, we come across a very vivid scene of Yom Kippur in Lublin. And here I quote again: "Lublin's narrow streets, lighted by the setting sun, were now full of men wearing the white Yom Kippur robes. They looked like corpses in shrouds. The women wore white dresses with trains and silk scarves. They were arrayed in pearls and heavy necklaces, pins and bracelets, brooches and long earrings which quivered like jelly." And then you have a kind of a long description of what else is going on, and it ends with a reference to one of the Lublin Jews. Yerucham, the Lublin penitent, stood as he did every year at the door of the prayer house, barefoot, his clothes unfastened. Wringing his hands, he wept for his sins. Jews, have mercy. Jews, compassion. So again, a very lively image. And basically, when you think about depictions of Lublin in earlier centuries, for example, 18th, 19th century, this is like the symbol of certain stability for the Jewish community. Also, Isaac Bashevis Singer's older brother, Israel Joshua Singer, in his memoirs of a word that is known no more in Yiddish, von der Welt, what is nicht mehr, describes, among others, Lublin region in early 20th century. And he again contrasts Lublin region with other parts of Poland, and treating it as a kind of very traditional not very maybe civilized or advanced in terms of civilization, but a place where life continues without any special turmoil. And also in The Magician of Lublin, we have to remember that The Magician of Lublin was written after the war, but Bashevis singer recreates the world before the war. There is this memorable fragment which is often quoted to illustrate traditional Jewish life in Lublin. And here I quote, this is from chapter 1. The world beyond Lublin was in turmoil. Every day the Polish newspapers screamed war, revolution, crisis. Jews everywhere were being driven from their villages. Many were emigrating to America. But here in Lublin, one felt only the stability of a long-established community. So here, Lublin, stability of a long-established community. Some of the town's synagogues had been built as long ago as the time of Khmelnytsky, that is mid-17th century. Rabbis were buried in the cemetery, as well as authors of commentaries. This is a reference to the old Jewish cemetery in Lublin, one of the oldest in Poland, next to Krakow. So the reference of these rabbis buried, each under his tombstone or chapel. Old customs prevailed here. The women conducted business and the men studied Torah. So actually the Magician of Lublin, which takes place mainly in Warsaw, because the main character comes from Lublin. He has his faithful wife here, and he returns home at the end of the novel after his adventures, but most of the action takes place in Warsaw, because basically he wants to leave this stable, traditional, but boring world for him for a more exciting world, first Warsaw, then maybe Western Europe, but eventually he returns to Lublin. And maybe one more interesting reference, or a little bit like an anecdote. I don't know if any of you have seen an adaptation of Bashevis singer's Yentl the Yeshiva Boy. There is this famous musical with Barbara Streisand, and this talks about a Jewish woman who is intellectually inclined, would like to study Torah and holy books, but as a woman she is not allowed to, so she has to disguise herself as a boy. And she goes first to a yeshiva in a small place, and then there is a scene when she goes to a yeshiva in Lublin. And the film was shot in Prague, so Lublin in that film looks really magnificent. So a number of people in Lublin kind of laughed at it, because there is no big river and there is this magnificent bridges. So they just looked at it as a Hollywood version. But metaphorically, in a sense, this is a very true depiction, because for Yentl, the Jewish woman from a small shtetl, Lublin was like a metropolis. And when we read Bashevis singer's other works, there is often a statement, for example, even in Lublin they didn't hear about such an event. So there is this contrast between Lublin and this provincial shtetl. So Lublin basically is in between those large cities, like, for example, Warsaw or Łódź, but that are not so stable, not so safe. And on the other hand, it's more attractive, more advanced than these little provincial towns. And well, lots of people associate Isaac Bashevis Zinge with Lublin, although he himself never lived in Lublin. But why does he situate the action of his novels or stories in Lublin? Because this was a very important city. But there is another author, Jakob or Jacob Gladstein, who was actually born in Lublin. He was born in Lublin in 1896 and left in 1914, just before the outbreak of the First World War, for New York. He wanted to become an international cosmopolitan poet. He joined a group of modernist poets called In sich, introspectivist poets, and he actually wanted to some extent to cut himself off from the Jewish community. He didn't want to be a kind of traditional provincial poet, but and his poetry from this period in New York, like the 20s, 30s, is quite experimental, modernist. But in the 1930s, under the influence of the events in Europe, especially Nazi Germany, he announced his return, in a sense, to Jewish roots. And in that period, in 1938, he traveled back to Lublin. So after 24 years, he came to Lublin because his mother was dying and he wanted to see his mother. This was July, August 1934. I'm sorry. The book was published in 1938, but he came in 1934. And from that period, there are two autobiographical novels, Wenn Jaś ist gefahren and Wenn Jaś ist gekommen. And for us, this first one is most interesting. Here I have an Yiddish edition of this novel, Wenn Jaś ist gefahren, because he describes here his travel, and he also recollects his childhood and young years in Lublin. And actually the novel ends with the word Lublin, because he travels by train, he meets a young Pole on the train, they talk, and then the train arrives at the station. But he doesn't describe Lublin in the 1930s. In his next novel, Wenn Jaś ist gekommen, he describes a little town not far from Lublin, Kazimierz on the Vistula, but not Lublin itself. But what is interesting in this first autobiographical novel, a depiction of Lublin before the First World War. And he describes Lublin there as also a very important center of Jewish life. And here there is a fragment that I would like to read, his recollections. The last weeks before my departure, before his departure in 1914, days spent in the Saxony Garden. This is a local park, well, still there, quite nice. Days spent in the Saxony Garden with spring blossoming along the verdant walks. My comrades and I strolled about with heads held high like the heroes of Hamsun's Growth of the Soil, because his friends are also interested in poetry, in literature, so they are these young, ambitious intellectuals. And he goes on by saying, we strutted like peacocks and were as unreal as characters out of a novel. Around us blazed a Gentile life. Several, one Polish and the other Russian, because this is still Poland under the Russian partition. at each other's throats, and a Jewish life in which worlds apart and separated like caste were the untouchable paupers and the Jewish aristocrats who rode in carriages drawn by spirited horses. Of course, this is a metaphor, an exaggeration, but what is interesting is that he described the variety of Jewish life. And then he mentioned lots of different professions. About us, the streets teemed with tailors, cobblers, tinsmiths, cigarette makers, brickyard laborers, sugar refinery hands, tanners, iron workers, teachers, water carriers, servant girls, stocking makers, seamstresses, musicians, wig makers, magnates, dayanim and rabbonim, tribunes of the Jewish court and rabbis. So there is this enormous variety of, because lots of professions that are no longer there, are no longer known. So basically we can say that up to the outbreak of the Second World War, Lublin has a rather positive image, we can say, in Yiddish literature or Jewish literature in general. And this changes radically under the influence of the war and the Holocaust. And one obvious reason is that Majdanek, one of the worst concentration and death camps, was established not far from Lublin. The large Jewish community of Lublin, more than 40,000 people. We have to remember that before the war, Lublin had about 120,000 inhabitants, and more than 1/3 were Jews, and most of them were murdered. Most of them actually not in Majdanek, but in another camp, terrible death camp, Bełżec. And so after the war, this plus Lublin was also the center of so-called Aktion Reinhardt, the plan, the murderous plan of murdering the Jews of the whole region. So when we read various reports from Lublin after the war by Jewish authors, even if they recollect the vibrant life before the war, the focus is on the destruction. And here, in a moment, I will also return to Gladstein, to Yiddish literature, but I want to make one exception and refer to a book which was originally written in English, and this is a memoir from the Holocaust years, Dry Tears by Nehama Tetz. Dry Tears, the story of a lost childhood. This is a kind of classic of Holocaust literature, non-fiction. Nehama Tetz is a well-known psychologist, now Professor Emeritus, an author of many books about the Holocaust, also about the righteous among nations, about those Christians who helped Jews during the war. And she was raised in Lublin, actually in an Yiddish-speaking family, but her parents, like lots of Jewish parents at that time, didn't want her to speak Yiddish because they thought that Yiddish would kind of affect their daughter's future career. They preferred them to speak Polish. But so she lived sort of on the border between a traditional Jewish quarter and the Christian quarter in a rather wealthy family, so she had a happy childhood. But then during the war they were hiding in different places, not first in Lublin or in the Lublin region, then in near Kielce and other places, but she, in her memoirs, she devoted the whole chapter to Lublin before the war, and the title of this chapter is My Word Before, and here she has some very interesting observations, but she talks about the two groups, Jews as Christians, as living their separate lives. For example, I quote, "Because of its location, most of the tenants in our apartment house were Christians, and yet the only neighbors we knew were Jews." So they lived together in the same apartment house, but very few contacts, very few socializing. Our Christian neighbors, both adults and children, were complete strangers to me. I never wondered why this was so, nor was I ever upset by it. So she just took it for granted. That's how it was supposed to be. Well, she was a young girl. She was about 7 or 8 when the war broke out. Indeed, only later did I realize that although I lived in the Christian section of the city, I had never succeeded in entering the Christian world. And but what is most interesting in this novel, or in this memoir for us, in this context of this change from rather positive image before the war to this traumatic image after the war, is the last chapter of her book, where she describes her return to Lublin in 1944 after the years of hiding. And here's a fragment from her memoir. "We reached Lublin at dusk." And here may be an explanation why 1944, because those territories were liberated or taken over by the Soviet army in late July 1944. So the war didn't end yet, but already in 1944 those Jews who were in hiding in that area who could come out of hiding, and actually the first Jewish committee was established in Lublin. So this was a center. So in a sense we have here a parallel between this time of the Khmelnytsky uprising described in Satan in Gorai that I quoted earlier, where all these people were coming to Lublin looking for their relatives. So a similar thing happened in Lublin in 1944 when refugees, survivors were coming and also looking for their dear ones. But here, going back to this quotation, we reached Lublin at dusk. My father gave the driver our old address, Pijarska number 1. Why did he do that? Was it a sentimental move? That would have been out of character for my father. Did he expect the apartment to be waiting for us? We didn't own the place, and we had left it many years before. The truck came to a stop, and we all jumped down. Before us stood a ruin. Bombs must have demolished the entire street, because actually Lublin wasn't so much affected by the war like other cities, for example Warsaw, but this particular area was bombed early during the war. So the house where she used to live no longer existed. We said nothing at all. I turned to my father looking for strength, but for the first time he had no strength to give. He stood absorbed in his thoughts. He looked tired, so very tired. I wanted to reach out to him, to touch him and comfort him. I made no move. None of us made a sound. Still in silence, we climbed back into the truck, which once again started to move, this time toward our chemical factory, because her father was a partner in a chemical factory. So going back to Dry Tears by Nehama Tetz, here is this most memorable fragment, and which gives you an idea of how survivors felt returning to their home cities and towns. And here is Lublin, but of course this is a feeling of many survivors in other places as well. Pressed into the corner of the truck, I was overcome by sadness. Around me was the city of Lublin, my city. I could hear it, I could smell it, but neither its noises nor its smells were familiar. I felt like a stranger. Was this really the city I knew? I refused to look, afraid that what I saw might confirm my doubts. I closed my eyes instead. So this is this kind of very typical feeling of survivors returning to the places they knew after the war, even if the places were not destroyed, even when they were almost untouched. Those were different places, because the people they knew were not there, the stores they knew were not there, so it looked different, it smelled different. Quite often people describe those places, especially in small towns, as half dead. And now returning to Gladstein, I mentioned earlier during my lecture that when Gladstein was leaving Lublin in 1914, he actually wanted to escape from this provincial and rather suffocating life. But later in his years, already via those autobiographical novels and his travel to Poland in 1934, but even more after the war, he returns to Lublin more and more via his poetry. And I have to stress the fact that this is an intellectual and psychological return, not a physical return. This is similar with Bashevis Singer, who didn't want to come to Poland after the war. For example, when he got Nobel Prize, he was invited by various organizations, Polish writers. They were would have been very happy if he came, but he stressed the fact that he didn't want to visit Poland because he remembered the world as it was before the war. So then he couldn't imagine the world without the Jewish community, and actually it could have affected his artistic integrity. How could he write about it, seeing, let's say, Warsaw without the Jewish quarter? And I'm not sure how it was at Gladstein, but probably he also preferred to live in Lublin of his memoirs rather than go to post-war Lublin. And one of his most interesting collections published after the war is this beautiful edition, Aid von Lublin. So even when you think about the title, Aid von Lublin, a Jew from Lublin, so it's basically the poet's declaration, I am a Jew from Lublin. And not all the poems in this collection refer to Lublin, but this is his, in a sense, like a poetic manifesto. Actually, this is a very interesting edition because there are some illustrations of places in the old town. And here now I'm giving this lecture actually not far in Brama-Grodzkan, not far from the places where the action of some of these novels takes place, and this is also an edition actually with Gladstein's autograph, Mit Freundschaft. Of course not for me, but I bought it somewhere in a second-hand store. And how does Gladstein describe Lublin after the war? He doesn't describe Lublin after the war, he tries to commemorate Lublin. And there are a number of poems in which he refers to Majdanek, for example. He was also one of the editors of one of the first anthologies of Holocaust literature published in the United States. And there is also quite a lot of focus on Majdanek, but the most meaningful is his piece of poetic prose. It's not really a poem, it's a poem in prose, Lublin, my holy city. And let's read a few fragments from this poem. Lublin, my holy Jewish city, city of great Jewish poverty and joyous Jewish holidays. Your Jewish streets smelled of whole wheat bread, sour pickles, incense, herring, and Jewish faith. The Hasidic synagogue, the Maharam synagogue, and the Maharshal synagogue, the workers' little houses and little synagogues, because Lublin had about 20 different Jewish prayer houses, all gave an air of holiness to the inter-Sabbath periods of everyday commerce, so to speak. And then here he refers to religious life in Lublin. In the next paragraph, he describes secular life in Lublin. He says, Lublin, my holy city of young boys and girls thirsting for education, and the deliciousness of proud Yiddish, modern Hebrew schools, professional unions, and here he mentions different secular organizations. And so he recreates this pre-war Lublin, and then he says, holy city of mine, you ask this honor for yourself, that when they would burn 1.5 million Jews, they should do it in the shadow of your nearly 1,000-year history of Jewishness. So here there is this bitter paradox. He said, you ask this honor for yourself. I take off my shoes when I come to the Majdanek woods. Of course, again, metaphorically, he's never been to Majdanek. The ground is holy of holies, for the Jewish people lies resting here in the shadow of hundreds of pious generations. So again, a very bitter paradox, that this is the time, the stable, where long tradition, hundreds of generations are resting, but it's all now overshadowed by Majdanek. And then he asked this question, who will raise you up again and rebuild you, my holy city, now that you've been raised to your foundations and are one frightful gravestone? So in the original he uses the word matseve, you are the one terrifying matseva. And then he ends with a bitter reflection. They are hammering shingles and laying roofs. They are repairing and tidying up the old, disgusting world. But my holy city, the city of my world, will never be rebuilt. So this is the statement, the end of Jewish life. And here, if we think about the post-war period, we also can mention Lublin Memorial Book, Pinkas Lublin, Das Buch von Lublin. This is a Jewish memorial book where there are also a number of works, including literary works. Most of them, however, focus on Majdanek. There is also an interesting travel book published in Israel in the early 1950s by a Yiddish journalist Mordechai Zanin, and Mordechai Zanin visited approximately 100 cities and towns after the war, and wrote reports from these places, and among others there is a very interesting report from Lublin, and there he juxtaposes the Lublin before the war, this almost idyllic, safe city, with the destruction after the war. Now, what can we say? Is Lublin how does Lublin figure now in collective Jewish memory? Well, lots of Jewish visitors from the United States, from Israel, when they think of Lublin, they think of Bashevis Singer, especially the magician of Lublin, but also via the history of Hasidism, and here especially the seer of Lublin, Yitzhak Horowitz, a famous Hasidic Rebbe. So on the one hand, a kind of secular tradition, on the other hand, this religious tradition. And after the war, lots of traces of Jews in Lublin were erased, either consciously or not. And actually here, when we refer to this quote from Gladstein about rebuilding and repairing and tidying up the old world, that's what happened in the former Jewish quarter. Nowadays, when you come to Lublin and there is an empty square where in the past there was a very lively, poor but very lively Jewish quarter. And under the communism, because of censorship, also because for various political reasons that here there is no time to discuss, this Jewish past was almost forgotten, and actually only in the 1980s, and especially after the fall of communism in 1989, the situation started to change, and nowadays, fortunately, there are various initiatives in Lublin to commemorate Jewish Lublin. And in the place where I am now, Brama Grodzka, this is a very interesting place, educational and cultural center, where you can hear the voices and see some images from Jewish Lublin, and where you can learn quite a lot about this past. There are also some commercial undertakings, and of course you can look at it skeptically, but even if they sometimes border on kitsch, in a sense they popularize some of these topics. For example, Lublin in recent years has become a center of a very popular festivals. This is called, in English it would be like jugglers or acrobats or magicians festival, and lots of visitors come to Lublin in summer, but this is obviously a reference to the magician of Lublin, so this is not a coincidence that that a place which became famous thanks to a novel by Bashevis Singer now is a host for such a festival. And maybe last but not least is that to some extent Yiddish and Jewish Lublin and some elements of Yiddish return indirectly via works written in Polish. There is quite an interesting writer in Lublin now, Marcin Wroński, who writes detective stories, a kind of what we call retro fiction, retro crime fiction, a kind of pastiche of old detective stories, and all of them takes place in Lublin in the interwar period. And of course, if he recreates pre-war Lublin, he has to also partly recreate the Jewish world. Thank you very much for your attention.